Hello everyone. I needed to make some replacement brake lines for a recent repair job on my Subaru Outback. So I bought a 25-foot roll of 3/16 inch copper nickel brake line in a kit, which included 10 metric flare fittings, size M10 by 1. I've never worked with these copper nickel lines before, but they say these lines are easy to bend and work with, and they were. They also say these copper nickel lines will never rust. I hope that's true, but only time will tell on that one. These lines did prove to be easy to cut, and they were easy to bend by hand. Best of all, they were easy to double flare, and in this video, I'm going to show you how that's done. Okay, so for purposes of this double flaring demonstration, I'll be using this Matco double flare tool kit that I bought probably in 1979 or 1980. This is what it looks like. It comes with a flaring bar, a T-handle they call that, a yoke assembly that the T-handle is used to tighten and loosen, and these double flare adapters. And what these do is insert into the end of the tubing, and there's a little rounded area in there that it forces the end of the tubing to kind of, well, it starts out round and it kind of curls in like that. And then you go to just the regular standard flare, and that point pushes those in. So you're actually wrapping the end of the tube inside on itself. That's what a double flare is. And to cut the tubing, I've always used this imp tube cutter. It's just a little tubing cutter. There's a couple rollers in there and a cutting wheel that rotates as you spin this around on the tubing. So I'll demonstrate using those. By the way, if you're interested in getting a double flare toolkit, there's a link in the description below. This is nice and soft and flexible and easy to work with. So as an example, I need a 12-inch section of brake line. So I'm actually going to make it 13. I like adding an extra inch because it's difficult to make tight bends in the line when you're installing it. There's always some risk of kinking the tubing when you're making a tight bend. A little extra length allows you to make larger radius bends, which are less likely to kink. So the imp cutter functions kind of as a C-clamp. As you can see, it gets tighter as you screw that down, and looser as you screw it the other direction. And so the thing to do is you rest the tubing in those two rollers there. Tighten it down until the cutting wheel makes contact. And I'll do that now. Right around my mark here. There it is. Just to show you what that looks like. Make it nice and snug. Roll it around. Snug it up, roll it around. Snug it, roll it around a couple times. Nice and tight. Roll it around. And you just keep tightening it layering it around the tubing like that. And that's that. That's how easily that cuts. This tubing came with this little cover, end cover for the tubing, just to keep debris out, I guess. So I'll replace that back on there. And so the next step will be deburring the inner ID on these tubing ends. So the next step is to ream this out. You're just removing the burr from the inside diameter of the tubing where you cut it. That looks nice and clean. And this tool I'm using is more of a machinist's deburring tool or chamfer tool. But that's a nice clean inside diameter on that tube. Another type of tool you could use is the reamer that's on a tubing cutter, and you would just ream that out. I think this tool gets much better results. Okay, here's the instructions for double flaring. This kit works with thin wall steel tubing, aluminum, or 40 thousandths wall soft copper. I'm going to show you how to do each of these steps. Prepare end of tubing carefully by making sure tubing is cut off square. Deburr inside with reamer blade of a tube cutter. Chamfer the outside with either a file or a grinding wheel. This preparation is essential to obtain correct forming. Insert tubing through the correct size hole in the flaring bar. Extend tubing beyond surface of flaring bar to proper distance as determined by placing corresponding size adapter flat surface down alongside tubing, so end of tubing is flush with step on adapter as shown in figure 1. Tighten wing nuts securely, starting with the wing nut nearest the tubing. This is referring to the flaring bar. Be sure flaring bar holds tubing tight enough so it will not slip down. Insert stem of adapter into end of tubing. Place yoke assembly over flaring bar and adapter so that swivel enters depression in the end of the adapter. With sliding T-handle, turn and force swivel down until adapter rests flat against flaring bar as shown in figure 2. The end of tubing is now formed into a bell shape, which completes the forming operation. Back off swivel and remove adapter from tubing. Now turn swivel down against bell shape of tubing so that metal folds in on itself as shown in figure 3. This operation is the same as a conventional single flare. So to recap, we've cut the tubing square, we've deburred the tubing, now it's time to chamfer the ends of the tubing. Okay, so now I'm going to chamfer the outside edge of that. I'm shooting for a 45-degree chamfer. And you know how I used that machinist tool to clean out the ID? I wish I had one that would form the OD on that chamfer. but I don't. So I'm going to start with a grinding wheel and then maybe finish it by doing a little cleanup with a file. And I need to do both ends. I'm just gently twisting it and applying very light pressure. That seems to look really good. Now for the other end. That's a really good start. When I purchased this roll of tubing, this is a 25-foot roll, it came with a number of flare fittings. To use with it. That's a really convenient thing. At this point, so that I don't forget to put the flare fittings on, I'm going to put them on now before I flare the ends. Putting them on after you flare the ends isn't possible. You'll end up having to cut the tubing and re-flaring again. And so just for now, I'm going to wrap some tape around them, tape them to the tubing so they don't slide off or get lost. Now as I work on these, what can happen is you're so focused on doing this right that when it's time to flare the other end, you forget to put your fittings on. So this way I know I have both fittings on the tube. Now I can flare the ends without thinking about, have I remembered to put the flares on? Like I did yesterday. I left one of them off. I had to recut the tubing. I ended up with a slightly shorter length of tubing, and it worked out fine, but I just made more work for myself. Okay, this is the flaring bar, and you put the tubing in these different size notches they have in it to hold the tube. Inside these notches they have serrations or possibly threads that grip the tubing so it won't slide out. So you insert it like that, flip that over, snug it down, and now I'm going to use this forming adapter to set the height of the tubing in relation to the forming bar, the flaring bar. Snug it down nice and tight. You snug down this end first, the end closest to the tube first, and then you really tighten down on the farthest end away. This has more leverage to really get a grip on it. And I don't know if you'll be able to see how I have this set. You can see that's about the right height in relation to the adapter. Okay. And then flip the adapter over, and that pin on the adapter inserts into the tube. Like that. So this is a yoke assembly. You put it over the bar, line it up so that the point on that yoke is in the center of that adapter. This is a swivel point. It needs to be center in that adapter. These adapters have a chamfered hole in them, so the point of that swivel goes into that center hole on top. Okay, that's what it looks like. So they call this a sliding T-handle. It's just a bar that slides through there, and you crank down on it. Tighten it down until that adapter is flat on the flaring bar. Basically, you're compressing the end of that tubing. And there it is. It's as far as it needs to go. Release that. Pull this adapter out. Now, because that tubing has been distorted and formed, it's going to be slightly difficult to pull that off. I'm just going to get a pair of pliers to grab it and pull it. So basically, that's what it looks like. You're just pulling it out. And that's what that first step of the double flare process looks like. We've actually managed to get that tubing to curl in on itself around the edge, like that. And then we're going to compress it the rest of the way with the point of this swivel. And then you just crank down on this. That's what it looks like at this point. I'm going to give it just a little more pressure. There, that's pretty, I cranked it down pretty hard there. You might be able to see the flare forming in there. Okay. Now just remove the yoke assembly from the flaring bar. And there's your double flare completed. It's got a slightly rough edge on it. I think I'll hit that with a file just to smooth it out. But now you can release it from the flaring bar, unscrew both of the wing nuts, spread the bar, remove the flare, and this is the end result. A nice, basically almost perfect double flare. So I'm going to use one of these little Chinese needle files. It's a flat file with a very fine surface on it. I'm just going to touch up this top end of this because it's a little bit rough, like it's got some little burrs on it. I don't think that would affect anything because the sealing surface is inside here. But I just don't like having that on there. And I'm using a very fine file because I definitely don't want to overdo it. There, that's nice. That's the best looking double flare I've ever done. Just about perfect. Now I'll move on and do the other end. It's the same process. And I already have 2 flare nuts on there, oriented properly so they're facing the right direction to go to either end. And there it is. Release it from the flaring bar and let's have a look at it. What do you think? It's not as pretty as the first one, but it's very serviceable. Now I'm just going to file off the burrs on this end again. This tubing is different from regular brake line tubing that I'm used to using. So it behaves a little strangely. But it's actually easier to work with. Okay, flare number 1. Looks great. Flare number 2, there's a little bit of flash sticking out from the sides of the tubing. Do you see it there where that bar squeezed it out a little? It's like a protrusion that is preventing the flare nut from going all the way to the end. So I'm going to go ahead and just gently file that down a little bit. Not too much. But I need it to be flat enough so that the flare nut will slide all the way to the end. And there it is. Still hangs up a touch. I'm going to just touch it a little more on the end. You might be able to see what I was filing. Let's see. Right there. That's facing the camera. Little shiny line there. Right along there. Okay. That's a good flare. That's a good double flare. And now I'll be using this. So this is a palm sander with some fine grit, is all it said on it. Fine grit emery cloth. I've got it clamped in my Black & Decker Workmate just to hold it. So what I'm thinking is that since the grindstone, the grinding wheel, is so coarse, that's probably what's causing those burrs I've been detecting. Yeah, there's burrs right there on the edge. I catch them with my thumbnail. That maybe the grinder should be followed up with a little fine grit sanding just to smooth it up before you actually do the double flare. So I'm going to test that out here. That definitely made it smoother to the touch. I don't know that the chamfer on the edge there is more even. I think that needs to be done on the grinder. Make sure that's an even chamfer all the way around. And because this has a soft pad under it, it's tended to round out, to make the surface somewhat rounded rather than flat on the chamfer. But I'm going to try that out on the double flaring tool and see how that works out. So we've got a pretty wicked thunderstorm going on out there right now, so I'm stuck with the doors closed, working indoors, which is not my first choice. That actually looks pretty darn nice. Slightly off center. Not too bad. And by the way, I intentionally left the flare nuts off this. So before I can use this piece of tubing, I'm going to have to cut one end off and redo it. But for purposes of this demonstration, I don't need a nut on it. And I've got to say, this turned out really nice. Unfortunately, the light reflects off the shiny surface inside the flare there, so the camera doesn't really do it justice. But I'll tell you, it looks really nice to me. And the question of the burr on the top, it's still there. Not as bad as it was before I tried sanding the chamfer, but it's definitely still there. I don't think it's a problem. The burrs that were there before were quite pronounced. These are significantly less. Just a quick touch up with a file, just to take that sharp edge off them. And this flare is ready to go. The red arrows here point to the 12-inch lengths of rear brake lines I had to replace. The blue arrow points to the new hose that was installed. I did exactly the same thing on both sides of the car. This arrow points to the end of a pre-existing brake line that had to be redone. I was replacing the brake hose you can see there, and the old flare nut would not twist loose without twisting the end of the brake tubing along with it. So I had to cut it off to try to save as much of the untwisted brake line as possible. Then I straightened that line by hand to get it to stick out far enough so I could chamfer it and double flare it. After that, I was able to bend it by hand into position as it's pictured there now. And here's some photos of double flares I did to use as examples in this tutorial. Thank you for watching. Please take a moment to like and subscribe.